You know this medium. You may not be an artist or a critic. You may have never been to a gallery or gazed upon the works of masters whose names you have never known or that time itself has forgotten. But you know what tools they used here. You yourself have rollicked in its whimsy. From its vibrant hues to its semi-opaque nature to the subtle trail its pigment has left as it danced over the fibers of the canvas. You are delightfully acquainted with this, the master's medium. Watercolor has been used for centuries to depict fantastical scenes and subjects. From infant to elder, peasant, scribe, theologist, scientist, and master of art, all have laid the simple mixture of pigment and water to paper. Dating as far back as the earliest records of Egyptian civilization and perhaps deeper into Paleolithic Europe, watercolor has some of the deepest ties to human expression. Yet, watercolor is oft called the master's medium for its extreme difficulty to execute properly. The very nature of water is unforgiving and immovable once seeped into its canvas. It's a medium that requires precision and confidence, particularly when executing more complex scenes. Unlike the more popular medium of oils, which dries slow and can be pushed and smudged, watercolor is quick to dry and has immutable opacity. Watercolor is also extremely complementary to other mediums such as ink, graphite, and is even the basis of gouache. It's beloved for its whimsy, the subtle texture left by its pigment, its light, dreamy quality, reminiscent of stained glass. The medium of watercolor lends massive power to the story the artist is conveying in their composition. As such, it's married, devoutly it seems, to the high fantasy genre. Some of the greatest, most powerful stories ever told. Tales of knights, hermits, triumph, vanquishment, heresy, miracles, dungeons, dragons, and magic. Magic has its own history dating back to the summer of 1993 when the Alpha Set was released. Since its release, Magic the Gathering has featured watercolor art on a massive array of cards. One of the most notable of all time, painted by Rob Alexander. Underground Sea. One of the 10 original dual lands and an icon of the game, and yes, painted in watercolor. We stand at the edge of the world, beset by sheer rocky cliff faces. At the bottom of frames, small pockets of sand are pulled from the fine, warm beach where it meets the soft rolling tide of our glistening sea. Alexander's use of glassy greens and playful indigos blend softly in the water, bending the light and changing the water's depth. Silky foam gathers over careful shades of blue to give the rippling waves dimension. Calm and warm and inexplicably quiet, the foam of the sea floats delicately towards us. Alexander breaks the foreground and background with 2 titanic earthen pillars to either side, which curl round to form the mouth of the cave. Green pockets of grass or algae line the base of the left monolith. It's impossible to confuse this with a distant forest because Rob has given us visual scale. We understand the size of the waves in front of us and can compare that subconsciously with the readable detail in the monoliths. Thus, without a thought, we can perceive the distance and scale of the green mass. Beyond the pillars, pregnant cumulonimbus clouds move over the distant, subdued waters, giving a sense of distance and depth. Soft, loose brushstrokes and smooth gradient generate the iconic fluffy shapes. Again, the size of the clouds to the rocks provide a reference to understand the scale of the scene. Across the top of the scene and sweeping beyond the frame, altocumulus clouds wash over the glowing orange sky. Just above the horizon line hangs a rising sun. Or is it setting? Or perhaps this is an eternal sun. Not a celestial body, but one grounded deeply beneath us. You see, at top right, we see repeating cliffs which arc harshly into the distance, multiplying until covered in atmosphere, never truly ending. This detail, to me, is where the genius of Rob Alexander's composition is realized. An underground sea. A sun which cannot set. The core of a planet molten and glowing like a sun. Echoing cliff faces for visible eternity which sit higher than even the clouds. A setting possible only within an earth which is hollow. When I sit with this piece, I can't help but think of Hollow Earth theory and its influence on fantasy works. Is the very core of the world where we stand a slave to our spellbook? A powerful secret, one which only the most daring and learned wizard could obtain. This would tie perfectly together with Magic's gameplay, as well as the mana which Underground Sea produces. Blue, the color of knowledge, and black, the color of power, no matter the cost. Alexander's work is an excellent example of what a highly rendered out and realistic composition can be when watercolor is used by a master of the craft. Rob Alexander has birthed a myriad of masterpieces for Magic, many of which are lands, including several original dual lands. I encourage you to explore your favorites and see what techniques and patterns you notice. Overall, this is an outstanding piece of watercolor art in the halls of Magic the Gathering's rich and vibrant artistic history. Thousands of paintings could line the halls of a gallery were it dedicated to MTG art. Hundreds of names, some you may not recognize. There are, however, a handful of artists in Magic's 3 decades whose works champion endless praise and admiration from players. A few, in no particular order, would include Seb McKinnon, John Avon, and Kev Walker. All sport a unique style and list of motifs which resonate with players. But there's another name I'm sure you all know. The unofficial queen of Magic art, Rebecca Guay. Rebecca Guay has a massive portfolio of Magic commissions of particular notoriety to study and consume, but I chose to focus on one of my favorites, Bitter Blossom. Long, sharp, heavily angled ears, pronounced but modest bone structure, and skin of an almost patinaed porcelain. This is the classically inspired fae we see Lorwyn infested with. Insect-esque and modern in interpretation, Guay's fae maintain strong human anatomy and proportion, even as their form adopts its bug qualities. The extreme foreground houses a fairy sweeping through frame from left to right, which produces a sense of entering as opposed to fleeing the scene. A strong profile and beautiful gesture achieved with the tight curving lines throughout the form. Chin pointed, chest almost parallel to the ground, and arms swept along the length of the torso give a powerful sense of speed to this gliding fae. A sloped back forehead, soft brow ridge, and an extremely modest nasal bone give a delicate, not quite human appearance while still escaping the uncanny valley. Pale green skin with teal spots blend with the anatomical oddities balancing the human and insect features. Juicy purple eyeliner and long sweeping brows warn of the potential danger of these mischievous entities, complementing the skin beautifully. Black slick hair floats down an elongated neck and guide our eye into the left of the frame where the dark brambles that house these fae twist and contort, presumably that of the Bitter Blossom. Our attention is pulled to the center of frame by the sudden contrast in color. Framed by the swirling vines and branches, our midground hosts 2 more fae. In full view, wings of a generic, bug-inspired shape spread wide. A faint wash is used to allow the background detail to pass through, creating a translucent look. Hair, not quite as black so as not to disrupt priority and depth, sprawls violently up and out of frame like a cyclone. Again, Guay exhibits a powerful gesture full of energy. A spear, paper thin and sharp like a stinger, is drawn like an arrow in an aggressive stance. Its target, out of frame right. It gazes towards the foreground, the same direction the primary phase stare points. This warrior fairy has its legs tucked beneath it as if it's just leapt into the air, but here it gives more of a feeling of legs which are spring-loaded. A type of fairy fighting stance, something nimble and athletic, ready to explode into action, like a sprinter on the line. Our final fae is tucked low and off to the left, one arm stretched forward, gripping a bed of petals, ready to creep and crawl. As if prowling, their pose suggests it's unready to give up its position, but alert and cautious. All the fae in this scene are in active poses, poised to pounce, taking a post in this bramble of rich, delicious purples and blues. The busyness and tightness of the composition evoke the feeling of bees in a hive, agitated and ready to mobilize to defend their home. Such immense movement and energy is carved into this composition by Rebecca's tremendous use of active gestures and swirling line. The palette is cool, playful, and shaded, yet balanced magnificently with the warm browns and ever so subtle reds. The extreme background outside of the safety of this flora cove is implied by suggesting an overexposed light source and out-of-focus leaves behind the Archer Fairy. Guay's style, which is mixed with color pencil, makes full use of watercolor's semi-opaque nature, building saturation and controlling value, as well as getting a little bit of that stained glass effect. The masterful execution of lighting and depth in this piece denotes a wealth of understanding for the medium. Top to bottom, Rebecca Guay's work showcases classic high fantasy inspiration and oozes cleverness and intelligence. But even with the splendid story Rebecca's Bitter Blossom sings aligning with the very definition of fantasy art, watercolor is not bound to any law more than any other artistic medium. Watercolor, despite its natural and authoritative merriment, is just another tool to be utilized by we, the truly greatest of apes. Watercolor may just as well convey something darker, more sinister, and intentionally devoid of vitality, though no less saturated in vigor. Enter Richard Kane Ferguson, and his chiefest gift to the magic world, Dakon Blackblade. Toxic, sulfurous, snide, unforgiving, neither monster nor man, but something sickening and in between. The last Nephilim doomed to walk the world of the living. This is what goes through my mind when I look at R.K. Ferguson's art for Dakon Blackblade. Black and shadowy with blue-gray midtones and limited highlights, Dakon sits heavily in the middle of frame. He towers menacingly at almost a profile, cheated out. A hypermasculine bicep and tricep peer over a shield decorated with a hypnotic, specter-like effigy. Connected to a deltoid clad with armor decorated with a skull, this forward-facing arm gives us a sense of his physical strength. The rest of his torso has its own adornment of form-fitting armor which mimic his overdeveloped pectorals, abdomen, and obliques. We can see his ribcage jutting away contrary to his abs, creating a sharp valley illustrating his non-existent body fat. Low on his hips, a simple belt from which the tattered tendrils of his tunic wriggle eerily in the wind. The left of Dakon's body sits heavy, not just with the weight of a spiked bracer reminiscent of the Dark Knights, but the namesake of this legendary summon, the Black Blade. A wicked armament with a villainous decorative pommel, two-handed hilt, and titanic crossguard which gives birth to an insidious blade. One which sports its own two fangs at its midriff, before coming to a curved back point. A point indicative of a blade meant for hacking and chopping. A blade of tremendous mass, perhaps one that even grows with power and gravity. A possibility highlighted by the back-facing cut which reduces the weight of such a tool. It rests menacingly over the hidden trap of our subject, tucked behind the dastardly head which crowns this twisted stacker of corpses. A helm, horned like a rhino beetle and decorated with vicious filigree, adorns the northest point of Ferguson's unpenitent subject, a helm which hosts the ghoulish head of our calamity. Diluted down to nothing more than a simian scowl and the faint, ungodly glow of a beady red eye, Dakon's identity is left to the imagination, if you can stomach it. Richard Kane Ferguson draws hyper-masculine proportion and dark fantasy inspiration from the movement of the 1970s and 1980s. Particularly, you can see the inspiration of Frank Frazetta, who also worked in watercolor from time to time. But RKF isn't derivative. He's found his own style, which is on full display here. Chaotic brushstrokes are used to form loose, abstract shapes. The result is energetic and overwhelming at times, dawning the viewer with the intensity of the scene. The design of Dakon is well fleshed out. The muscles, while exaggerated, are not ballooning off the body, but rather look tight and sinewy. This is especially highlighted in the use of reflections and striation in the tricep. RK exhibits a well-known technique for character design, making the lower part of the design much darker and therefore heavier feeling, grounding the character, but also drawing less attention. With all the weight and darkness in RKF's character, there's a choice to balance it with the background. One of a pungent yellow and sickly orange. In our midground, two yellow-brown monoliths spiral from the base of the frame to the heavens beyond it. The snake-like forms could be lasting effigies of a civilization Dakon has just raised. The towers framing the subject on either side contrast very lightly with the wash of the background. Here, RK makes use of watercolor's ability to be abstract and creates a murky haze, a brightly colored fog of pestilence or toxic gas. Again, a brilliant use of weight is applied to balance the scene further, using higher saturation at the top, gradiating to almost white at the bottom to contrast the main subject's design. While Richard Kane Ferguson utilizes much implied detail in his pieces, he also uses touches of ink to create a hard outline around parts of the subject. Noticeably around the helm, where RK lets the background bleed in to create a reflection like a rim light. Dakon Blackblade, a scourge from magic's past which echoes still through lore. From Corlash to the Blackblade Reforged to Gideon, Richard Kane Ferguson helped guide Magic's universe from the very beginning. Unique in style and non-traditional in execution, you might not have realized this was a watercolor piece. Richard Kane Ferguson proves watercolor is merely a tool and not a rule set. Style, execution, depth, palette, implied detail, render, supplementary mediums, these all play a role in how an artist tells a story. Their being, their inspiration, their motifs, a lot can be derived from an artist's work. I was originally inspired to make this channel after a short exchange with renowned MTG artist Jason Rainville. He tweeted about how he wished content creators who got to preview cards talked about the art more, rather than naming the artist and moving on to the mechanics of the card at best. He also made a comment recently about how Magic sets fly by, which exacerbates people's unwillingness to slow down and really digest the art. But frankly, most people aren't art literate. They're never taught how to consume and appreciate art, its intricacy, and its process. I want people to appreciate and understand art more and be grateful to the artists who work on MTG. What inspired me to explore this medium and help you digest this beloved and ancient practice? Another highly respected MTG artist made a comment on Twitter which immediately resonated with me. It was a perfect example of what I wanted to absolve with this channel. Sam asked why they got compared to Rebecca Guay as often as they do. They wondered if their last name was different, if it would happen as often. They aren't related, and the only relation their art shares is the medium. I told Sam I thought it was 50-50, half due to their last name and half due to the layman being art illiterate. The average Magic player who, through no fault of their own, were never taught to understand and consume art. Sam utilizes a very stylized and painterly method in their art for Magic cards. You can tell it's watercolor more than Richard Kane Ferguson's or Rob Alexander's pieces. This creates an impression similar to Rebecca Guay's art when evaluated at a superficial level. Sam seemed to agree with the possibility and added the obvious difference in their style versus, say, Jason Rainville's, rendered fantastical realism being the majority of Magic the Gathering's contemporary art direction. I thought I could teach players the difference. I could show them how to enjoy the art more and really love all the styles artists present for Magic players. So I sat down and found a handful of watercolor artists with different styles to show you how to digest a composition and value all the work and story put into them. So, with our intent in mind and a job to do, let's dive into our last two artists. Recently, a new artist debuted in the Magic the Gathering scene with work in the 2021 set Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Sam Guay. As one of the latest additions to Magic's roster of artists, Sam has very few pieces to speak on compared to the last artists, yet it was no less difficult to pick one to highlight. In the end, I landed on Innistrad and chose the art for Demonic Bargain. The striking palette makes me too giddy to ignore. A heavenly lavender with these subtle blues and low saturation blue-green all divorced from a blacker than night background. Elevating it all, though, a hot, gooey, scummy pink. It's disgusting how well Sam developed this palette and the hues in the final render. Just look at this piece. Its color. How do you feel? The lightness in the face of the pop-punk Belrog-like demon which takes up most of the frame immediately catches your attention. Its neon pink eyes squinting and contorting with the ether manifesting from the cup. Deep valleys and rolling peaks make up the texture of the demon's face, and continue through the horns. The dark blue hard lines act as recesses with white highlights opposite to create the depth. The feeling is palpable as the texture radiates through the shape of the horns which dissolve towards the edges of the composition. Here, the lines become more soft and blurred as the smoke diffuses and loses shape. The color also becomes more of a wash as the purples, blues, and pinks bleed together. It loses the form which was held in the center of the piece, made by the pale purple highlights, saturated purple terminator, and bluish purple shadow. The horns curl in towards the center again, leading your eye over a crusty, veiny, organic, and rather massive chalice. Why would Sam make this so big? Oh. Moving back over the demon, a stream of pink goo, now presumably blood, streams from the closed lips of the face which longingly hovers over the cup. Guay achieved the viscosity of the blood masterfully with their value choices. You can see the depth that it sits away from the face beautifully. A deep sea, blue-green face being lit from the chalice into which it leers. Subdued reflections of pink bounce off the most pronounced forms of the face and rest in the corners of the eyes where the tear ducts sit, confirming this liquid as blood. Expressionless, yet clearly somber, with sunken cheeks and a slack-craned neck, the demon's victim is clearly dying, in a pose reminiscent of classical depictions of Christ's death. Combined with the contrasting action of the hands below the cup, one gripping desperately, the other seemingly losing all strength, the gesture of this human figure is intrinsic. The story of someone who has given up their entire life force to a demonic entity. Power at any cost, they think, as they slip fatefully into the great sleep. The unceasing dream. Their scalloped hair invites small, ghastly skulls glowing with the same pink aura, and one slipping grimly from the ear of our Madonna. The soul of our subject, casting a faint glow on its former vessel, begins to slink into this cursed grail. The edges of the skulls in each victim's soul stretch and warp, communicating their immaterial form. Dark and diffused ribbons of smoke frame all sides of the composition without drawing attention from the subject. Sam Guay stations the entire composition of this work in front of a pure black background, creating a bold focus on the lighting and color of the scene while denoting the setting as somewhere beyond light. Further micro-details, such as the small glowing specks of light and vapor trails of the smoke, cement the feeling of being in between worlds, perhaps in the consciousness of our doomed traveler. We are helplessly watching their final moments. Powerful anatomy, though simplified and slightly exaggerated, help ground this stylized dreamscape. Sam utilizes a magnificent understanding of opacity and saturation in the use of color throughout this composition. What's more, a brilliance in utilizing watercolor's natural noisy texture shines here, as flakes of pigment are carried chaotically by the water over the canvas's fibers before it soaks into them, leaving a subtle, studded variation in saturation. Sam bends this to their will to give texture, especially in the smoky frame. The movement, line use, and rhythm throughout is fantastically well executed and shows a wealth of study in organic shapes and textures. Powerful, intelligent, whimsical, delicious, elaborate, these only scratch the surface of this remarkable piece by Sam Guay. Sam hands over a dream of theirs, which took hours upon hours of labor and decades of study and curiosity to bring our game to life. Frolic with me in the otherworldly microcosm captured and surrendered by a master of watercolor, Sam Guay. Magic the Gathering has changed, though. 30 years ago, Rob Alexander was not alone in delivering art to Wizards of the Coast painted in watercolor. Rebecca Guay never held a monopoly either. The exodus of watercolor art represented in Magic happened when the official style guide was updated. Focusing on more realistic rendered painterly art was the new norm. We're lucky to have Sam Guay working with Wizards after such a drought, and doubly so for the work of another. First commissioned for Throne of Eldraine's showcase card art, and returning for a single card in M21, our final artist rounds out all the variation in style we've seen, and we'll meet them in Kamigawa. Wylie Beckert. An excellent partner to follow Sam's organic, dreamy, vibrant style, Wylie Beckert's brilliant restoration sports a monochromatic palette, harsh line work, geometric patterns, and, well, it's still dreamy, but less Alice in Wonderland and more biblically accurate softcore liminal nightmare. In this piece, Beckert, in line with the card's white color identity, uses a slightly green-leaning ochre palette. This is a daring choice as an artist because everything now relies on their ability to control their values, value being the lightness to darkness of a hue. If overlapping features are the same value, they blend and blur, and the detail is lost. Despite the delicateness of this process, Beckert put forth a sublime render. A glowing orb of light, molten or bubbly in texture, glows like a small sun, full of energy and emitting rays of light. Along the rays, rectangles form a seemingly stylized lens flare. You can see the subtle variations in saturation of the globe which help give it texture. Spots of almost white, blotches of almost gray, and definitively yellow softly mingle to create height. Spooling around the orb, snaking through the entire scene, a dragon comprised of smaller organic shapes. A regal head births a snout, textured with smoky lines and shifting planar faces. Carp-esque fibers protrude from its lower jaw, and no eyes, rather masks of human faces on either side of its head and one in between, which themselves have a large eye on the forehead. A bizarre and beautiful detail, fantastically inspired, It is this eye that provides insight into this godlike creature. You see, the eye seems to have a pupil, but I believe Beckert was inspired by an eye not found in mammals, but in insects. This dot is not a pupil, but a light effect created in compound eyes, such as the ones a praying mantis has. A deeply subtle detail, but once observed, spotlights the omnipotence of this mysterious kami. Above its snout floats an obsidian sphere. Perhaps this is the antimatter which contrasts the sun, the balance of this new universe, the darkness to the light. Sprawling forth like hair from its head, thin, flat, papery appendages which form a crest or mane of ribbon-like geometry. Inspiring, perhaps, a papercraft-like effect in tandem with the folded prayer hands symbolizing this kami as a manifestation of the wishes and prayers of people on this plane. Some larger strands are pierced by golden, more mechanical spheres, though they seem to carry no weight as they don't make the strands droop, illustrating the lack of gravity in the scene. The humanoid arms build the form of the neck as it sprawls from the head, bent elbows forming the width of the neck and ribcage, and clasped hands forming the mass of the esophagus and belly. These forms ripple through the length of the body along with the rectangular sails, reinforcing the abstract and holy form of the main subject. With no other appendages of its own, the dragon's torso produces two human-like arms with 5-fingered hands. Outstretched with fingers splayed, it probes for stability. Or perhaps they're molding some unseen energy, kneading and stretching matter in accordance with the name and function of the card. These hands feature another oddity you may have noticed. Though monochromatic, the hands and snout of the dragon seem to break the palette subtly with a bit of orange to further highlight them without being visually jarring. Where this liminal space is absent of dragon and orb, it is filled with cloudy formations. Imperative to Beckert's style is her use of graphite. She maintains her line work in her paintings to give a clean, chiseled look to her geometric patterns and the edges of organic shapes. The clouds, for example, transition from beveled stone forms to loose, fluffy organic forms, moving from swirling to carving and back. We see similar shapes in our subject, its body full of beveled edges which seem to convex organically in between, bowing slightly to maintain the fleshiness of the creature. The ability to balance this dance is evidence of Beckert's understanding of line weight and speed of line and speaks to her learnedness. Compare the thickness at the edge of the neck to the edges of the arms composing the neck. This serves to give physical weight to the creature's anatomy. Extreme care and consideration put into every line consistently throughout the composition is tantamount to the movement created by the varied line shape. Surgical precision in the distribution of saturation through the length of the body pulls your focus to the center of the image where the richest yellows are concentrated along the belly, spine, and head. Less saturated midtones stretch over the parts of the body further towards the edges, not only lighting the scene, but controlling it. Wylie Beckert has an exquisitely unique style and produces highly controlled, well-balanced, detailed works. A brilliant artist with transcendent vision, Beckert's work serves as an excellent example of the diversity found in watercolor artists' style, if only you take the time to look. Art imitates life. The first noble truth of Buddhism suggests to live is to suffer. Suffering cannot be perceived without a struggle, an opposition. This is to say that art is a whisper of life's truth, of struggle, of suffering. The most destructive force on this planet is also the mother of life. It shapes mountains and buries civilizations. Her name is water. Soothing, cleansing, warming, cooling, quenching, but in a million ways, damning. Water is chaotic, timeless, and untamable. But for a brief moment, in a studio, a few drops at a time, it is coerced over a page to writhe around a canvas before suffering its master. Moved by those who struggle against its chaos, submitted by those who in turn submit to its imperfection. Dreamed, suffered, and surrendered in watercolor.